A lot of wrestlers come along and get heralded as being the next big thing. Unfortunately though, not all these performers end up working out. But what about the ones that do? What about the ones who come in with all the hype in the world and not only live up to it, but exceed it? Well, these are the people we're going to be looking at today. And where better to start than with a true blue chipper in Randy Orton. Yes, as the son of Cowboy Bob Orton and the grandson of Bob Orton Sr., there was a lot of expectations resting on Randy Orton's shoulders when he made his WWE debut in 2002. Hell, given his pedigree and his almost immediate entry into Triple H's Evolution stable, him becoming anything less than an all-time legend would have felt like a letdown. So it's just as well he became an all-time legend then. Seriously, over the course of the last 2 decades, the Viper has proven himself to be one of the greatest WWE superstars of all time and a surefire future Hall of Famer, with his list of accolades including 14 world title reigns, 2 Royal Rumble wins, 1 Money in the Bank win, and 2 WrestleMania main events. Even today, in fact, with him appearing to be at the tail end of his career, he's still a big enough star that he can appear in world title matches at major pay-per-views. And in terms of his actual in-ring wrestling, well, that's just as good as it ever was. And this was always great, let's make no mistake about that. Sure, he might get criticized for being unmotivated some of the time or overusing rest holds, but when Randy wants to, he can be one of the smoothest and best in-ring technicians out there. Someone who puts performers 20 years his junior to shame with his work. Really, it's hard to imagine what WWE would have looked like during the Ruthless Aggression era and beyond without him, as he's been such an integral part of the company for all that time. And it'll be hard to imagine a day when WWE no longer has him as an active part of their roster one day in the future. But Randy isn't the only one whose presence will be missed when he eventually goes, as there's another from the famed OVW class of 2002 that's also on this level. That's right, it's time to talk about Brock Lesnar. Where do we start with Brock? If we're talking about just a pure physical specimen, there might not be a better athlete in wrestling history. After all, for a man of his size and strength to be as fast and agile as he is, even now well into his 40s, well, that's just beggars belief, quite frankly. Of course, when it comes to the beast though, he's been proving how good he was since all the way back during his rookie year when, after less than 6 months on the main roster, he became the at the time youngest WWE champion ever. And since then, he's only continued to add to his list of achievements, not only inside the squared circle, but inside the octagon too. Yes, if being a 10-time world champion, a 2-time Royal Rumble winner, 1-time Money in the Bank winner, 1-time King of the Ring, and 5-time WrestleMania main eventer isn't enough, Brock also has proven himself in the world of shoot combat sports as well by becoming a UFC heavyweight champion and the man who put down both Randy Couture and Frank Mir. Then there's arguably his greatest achievement of all, being the guy who at WrestleMania 30 ended the near 2.5-decade-long undefeated streak of The Undertaker at the Showcase of the Immortals, with him creating a moment here that most people thought they'd never see. And that would fully solidify him as being the final boss of WWE, a role he's maintained up until his most recent run in 2023. However, it looks like Brock's days in the squared circle might be over for now. And that means it'll be up to someone else to take over as the big bad of the company. Who will this be in the men's division? Well, that remains to be seen. That said, we can be confident that the women's division has this sorted already, as they have Rhea Ripley. Now, Rhea is still relatively early into her career, of course, so you could argue that her entry in this video is premature. But come on, look at how big of a star she's become over the past couple of years. Hell, at this point, you could argue she's exceeded Becky Lynch as being the face of the division. And she's even the leader of her own stable in the Judgment Day, with all the men around her generally bending to her whims. Yes, it's been quite a rise for the Adelaide-born star, and one which we all should have seen coming, because even as far back as her days in the likes of NXT UK, it was clear she had an aura to her that couldn't be manufactured. Sure, she would have to overcome some questionable booking en route towards reaching her final form, but once she shacked up with Dominic Mysterio and became his mommy, it all finally clicked into place fully. So at this point then, it seems like the world really is her oyster, as before all is said and done, there's a real chance she becomes the greatest women's wrestler in WWE history, right up there with the likes of Chyna, Trish Stratus, and Lita. She's already proven she has what it takes to be a winner, what with her being a 2-time world champion and a 1-time Royal Rumble winner at the tender age of 26. And given CM Punk is now injured, there's a spot open for her and Becky Lynch to main event WrestleMania Night 1 later this year, should the company choose to give it to them. Will this happen? That remains to be seen. But even if it isn't this year, we've no doubt that Rhea will main event the Showcase of the Immortals before long and add yet another accolade to her growing list in the process. What happens after that? Whatever she wants, quite frankly, as there's no one out there who can stop her right now. That said, there are some who may try, as Rhea isn't the only one who wants to dominate the WWE's women's division into the next generation. Hell, our next subject has already been to the top of the mountain on multiple occasions, in fact, and no doubt wants to get back there as soon as possible. Who are we talking about here? Why, Charlotte Flair, of course. That's right, another generational talent. Charlotte Flair had high expectations weighing on her shoulders when she first stepped in the ring in 2012, as her father is none other than the Nature Boy Ric Flair, arguably the greatest wrestler of all time. And as we've seen before, wrestling talent doesn't necessarily pass itself down the gene pool in the Flair family, like in the case of David Flair. But with Charlotte, her father's skills certainly did transfer over to her, as almost immediately upon stepping in the ring, she was proving to be exceptionally good. Good enough that alongside Sasha Banks, Becky Lynch, and Bayley, she'd helped to revive women's wrestling in New York and bring it to all new heights. In fact, she'd helped take it to such heights that in 2019 at WrestleMania 35, the women would main event for the first time ever. And of course, the Queen would be part of this bout as it pitted her against the Man and Ronda Rousey in a three-way for the Raw and SmackDown women's titles. Of course, that is only a small slice of what Flair's achieved over the course of the past decade though, as she's also become a 14-time world champion and one-time Royal Rumble winner, with this being an even wilder list of accolades when you consider the fact that she's still only 37 and likely has another decade in her before she eventually chooses to hang up her boots. Really, the North Carolinian has achieved so much and lived up to the hype to such a degree that the only question left is what worlds does she have left to conquer anymore? Does her next step involve doing things like China did before her and going after some men's gold? Or will she eventually follow in the footsteps of one of her Four Horsemen stablemates and move on to new pastures like New Japan or AEW in order to dominate their women's divisions too? Anything's possible when you're as good as Charlotte is. And she wouldn't be the only former WWE star in AEW if she did this either, because 1/3 of our next subjects currently resides there as the reigning ace of the promotion. Yes, it's time to talk about the trio of Jon Moxley, Roman Reigns, and Seth Rollins, The Shield. Where do we start with The Shield? Really, there's no other stable in recent memory where every member has gone on to have the success that they have. Hell, usually when you get a great group, there are one or two breakout stars of the whole thing. But in the case of the Hounds of Justice, each of them has gone on to dominate the industry in their own ways. Of course, it started with them all being together and spending an 18-month period between 2012 and 2014, going from relative nobodies to legitimate main eventers. And after their run as a trio was done, they'd take this main event cachet and run right to the end zone with it, with them holding 15 world titles, 2 Money in the Bank wins, 2 Royal Rumble wins, and 7 WrestleMania main events between them as of the time of this video's recording. But it's not just the titles, no, it's the ground they've covered. Because if we look at all the major venues for North American wrestling, the Shield have marked their territory in each of them. And that's because right now Roman Reigns is the clear king of SmackDown, Seth Rollins is the top guy of Raw, and Jon Moxley is the main event of AEW. Hell, in Japan, Mox has made his mark by wrestling in the G1 Climax and holding the United States title, so even there they'd made everyone aware of just how much they run things. The only question we have left then is, will there ever be a time again when we see all three together in the ring to give a triple fist bump for old time's sake? Well, while it might seem unlikely, you can never say never. After all, given how wild wrestling has been over the last few years, who knows what the future holds? Maybe we'll see the return of Dean Ambrose one day, or look on in shock as the Architect and the Tribal Chief become All Elite. That said, if they ever did become All Elite, they'd have to prove themselves to a whole new roster, as in its relatively brief history, AEW has already seen a lot of top prospects blossom. And of these prospects, none have blossomed quite as much as MJF. Honestly, if we were going to pick one man as being the future of AEW, it'd be Maxwell Jacob Friedman. Sure, you could argue for someone like Adam Cole or Kenny Omega, but they're already in the latter part of their career. And when it comes to other younger guys like Darby Allin or Daniel Garcia, they're great, but they're not the former AEW World Champion. After all, who else right now has gone from being a nobody to at points the most talked about person in the entire industry with such light speed? And who else has had the string of excellent performances that he's had on such a regular basis? It doesn't matter if it's his work on the mic where he stood toe-to-toe with the likes of CM Punk, Jon Moxley, and Chris Jericho, or his in-ring bouts where he's proven just how good he is against performers such as Bryan Danielson, Samoa Joe, and Adam Cole. As it stands right now, he's one of the very best in the world. And considering he's still only 27 and in many ways just getting started, it's actually scary to think about what he'll achieve in the future. He's already a one-time AEW World Champion, with that reign being the longest reigning in history. How many more times will he hold this title before he's done, and how many more bangers will he put on in the process? And once those are under his belt, will he move to the WWE and proceed to dominate that roster too? It's really up to him, because as AEW's desire to keep him following a disagreement he had with management in the summer of 2022 showed, he's got everything any promoter would want and should be at the top of anyone's list when it comes to fantasy booking your own promotion. Honestly, in 20 years' time, we wouldn't be surprised to see MJF be listed alongside the likes of Ric Flair and Bret Hart when it comes to all-time greats of the wrestling industry. That said, if MJF wants to be better than our next subject in terms of success, then he has a long ways to go, because since starting out in 1996 as the son of Rocky Johnson and the grandson of High Chief Peter Maivia, The Rock has gone on to become probably the biggest mainstream breakout star the wrestling industry has ever seen. And this makes him a bigger success than even his most ardent supporters could have imagined. And he certainly had some ardent supporters back in the day, because being an absolute charisma machine and physical specimen who had the lineage he does meant WWE jumped at the chance to sign him when he first fell under their radar back in the mid-90s. Sure, it may have taken him a couple of years to find his footing, but once Dwayne Johnson did this and morphed from his original incarnation of Rocky Maivia into The Rock, there was no stopping him, as at that point, he became, quite frankly, undeniable. Seriously, if you were around in the late 90s and the People's Champion came on your screen, there was no way you were going to change the channel, as he was just so magnetic. And that's what led to him becoming the face of the company during 2000, as well as a 10-time world champion, 1-time Royal Rumble winner, and 5-time WrestleMania main eventer over the course of his in-ring career. But his wrestling career has only been a part of his success, as since retiring from full-time in-ring competition in 2004, he's gone on to become the biggest star in all of Hollywood, with him notably appearing in franchises such as The Fast and the Furious, Jumanji, and the DCEU, and being a key part in them, grossing hundreds of millions of dollars apiece in box office revenue. Really, at this point, would anyone be surprised if it was announced Dwayne Johnson was going to run for President of the United States? And would anyone be surprised if he won? He's already a major player in the business world, as he's not only the current owner of the XFL, but he's also a board member for WWE's parent company, TKO. So, for as wild as it may seem, don't be surprised if we're talking about President Rocky Maivia appearing at WrestleMania at some point in the future to tell us all that he's purchased the entire company, in the process proving why he might be the person who lived up to the hype more than anyone else in this video. That said, while our next subject isn't quite as successful as an entrepreneur, he's still very successful in his own right, and has also proven himself to be something of a prodigy in the ring during his short time there. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Logan Paul? Yeah, he might not be the most likable guy in the world to many people, but it's undeniable at this point that the YouTube star has taken to the ring like a duck to water. After all, despite only having 7 singles matches in his entire career, he's already arguably better at this than many of his peers. And sure, you could argue it's easier to have a great match when you're going up against the likes of Seth Rollins or Rey Mysterio and have weeks ahead of time to plan it out, but that still doesn't explain how smooth Logan is when he steps into the ring and how well he pulls every move off, including his own version of the buckshot lariat. Really, would we be surprised to see him be WWE champion one day at this point? It might feel like a step too far to many, but we can't entirely rule the possibility out, as he's certainly gotten over as a heel, and he's proved he can have a world title caliber match. And he's also proven he can hold gold around his waist convincingly, because as it stands right now at the time of this video's recording, he's the reigning and defending United States champion, with this being something he's been able to flaunt on his YouTube channel and help bring more attention to WWE in the process. But for as much of a prodigy as everyone's least favorite social media influencer has shown himself to be, and for as bright of a future as he has ahead of him should he choose to remain in the ring, he still has a long way to go if he wants to exceed our next subject, as when it comes to Kurt Angle, he went from being rookie to GOAT contender so quickly, it's still hard to process it to this day. Yes, you could argue Brock Lesnar technically reached the mountaintop quicker than Kurt did, but if you ask anyone who's the better wrestler, most will probably still go with Angle. And that's because he sits in that rarefied air alongside the likes of Ric Flair, Bret Hart, Eddie Guerrero, and Bryan Danielson as a legitimate contender for the greatest in-ring performer to ever do it. It's just as well he was as good as he turned out to be then, because once the the Pittsburgh native was signed to WWE in 1998, expectations for him were off the scale, as he was coming in as a gold medal winner in amateur wrestling at the 1996 Olympics, something he did with what was effectively a broken freaking neck. That said, just because he knew how to work shoot style didn't mean he was going to be a natural when it came to the theatrics of the pros. Just look at Gable Steveson if you need an example of this. But taking to the whole thing at light speed, Kurt was able to hang with the best of them before his first year on the roster was over. Hell, by the time October 2000's No Mercy pay-per-view came around, he'd be beating The Rock to become WWF champion for the first time. And after that, he'd go on to win the world title a further 5 times, all while he was also becoming the King of the Ring in 2000. That said, it wasn't just WWE Angle proved himself in, as once his time there came to an end in 2006, he'd move over to TNA, the place he'd spend the majority of his in-ring career. And while there, he'd hold their top prize 6 times, with this all being enough to make him a 3-time Hall of Famer, as it stands right now, across WWE's, TNA's, and the Wrestling Observer's pools. That's right, when it comes down to it, well, it's hard to argue against The Rock being the wrestler who most lived up to his initial hype in terms of mainstream success. Kurt Angle might just take that accolade when it comes to his work in the ring, because for as good as everyone knew he was, no one could have imagined he'd be quite this good, and no one could have imagined that even to this day, there's arguably no one else better to ever do it. But let's move away from WWE for a moment, and instead focus on their one-time chief rival WCW, as that's where we'll find our next blue chipper who completely lived up to the hype surrounding him and then some. Yes, we are sure you've already figured out who we're talking about here. After all, who else could it be but Goldberg? And yes, while he may not have been the best in-ring performer in the world, he never needed to be. No, what this Tulsa native had that few others did is a superhuman level of charisma and star power surrounding him, which helped to rocket him all the way to the top of the industry at the turn of the millennium. It didn't matter who he was going up against during his now iconic undefeated streak. Raven, Scott Hall, Curt Hennig, they all fell in short order and were forced to lay on the mat from there and watch as Bill asked us all, who's next? Hell, before long, WCW would be forced to have Goldberg go after the top guy the company had, as they simply couldn't deny him any longer. And this was what led to him challenging Hollywood Hogan for the WCW World title on the July 6, 1998 episode of Nitro in front of 40,000 fans inside of the Georgia Dome. Would he win this one? Of course he would. And after that, the former football player would be a made man, as across both WCW and later WWE 2, he'd become a 4-time world champion and 1-time Hall of Famer, with him still occasionally showing up today for a match against someone like Drew McIntyre or Roman Reigns. Will he still be around when the next great top prospect comes along? Possibly. In fact, there's a chance he might even wrestle this person and put them over.